Hello and welcome to the lesson on sentence fragments. Now, we talked in a previous lesson about how a sentence needs a subject and a verb, and how a subject and a verb form the core of a sentence. And so with sentence fragments, you have something that's trying to be a sentence, but it doesn't quite work. It's not complete. It lacks a subject and a verb. It lacks a subject or a verb, or it might have a subject and a verb, but it just does not express a complete thought. Let's look at some examples of what we're talking about here. All day on the beach. Okay, so there actually is no subject here, and there is no verb. What's happening all day on the beach, and who is doing it? We add here a subject and a verb, and now we have a complete sentence. We played all day on the beach. As Jake was eating ice cream. So this actually has a subject and a verb. The verb is was, or was eating is the phrase there. And then who is doing that action? Jake. So Jake was eating. But it does not express a complete thought. That addition of that word there, as, is one of those subordinating conjunctions. We talked a little bit about that in the lesson on Meet the Sentence, the parts of speech. But so when you add that word there, subordinating conjunction, it makes it an incomplete thought. We're waiting for that thought to be finished. So here's the completion of the thought. As Jake was eating ice cream, he dropped the bucket. Sometimes fragments can be difficult to spot when they're embedded in a regular paragraph, when you're in your writing. If they're sitting all alone on a paper, on a worksheet, it's easier to identify whether that thing is a fragment or not. But when it's embedded in a larger sentence, it's a little bit harder. So let's look at this example. I love going skydiving on beautiful days. Whenever I visit Hawaii, I go with an instructor, but maybe someday I will get certified to jump alone. As I read that, it seems like everything flows together nicely. It's a little bit hard to see the fragment. So one thing that you can do is just break it down and look at each part separately. Look at each sentence separately. Remember, when you put a period somewhere, you're saying this is a complete sentence. That is the end of a complete thought. So let's look at each one. I love going skydiving on beautiful days. Yeah, that's a complete thought. Whenever I visit Hawaii, that looks suspicious. And I go with an instructor, but maybe someday I will get certified to jump alone. So we can see here in isolation, whenever I visit Hawaii is a fragment. That does not express a complete thought. It's broken off from probably that previous sentence, and we can just fix it. So I love going skydiving on beautiful days whenever I visit Hawaii. Now that is a complete thought, it's a complete sentence. So often usually that's what happens, is fragments are just trying to be their own sentence, but really we need to tie them back into the sentence that they broke off from. One way to think about this is, and this doesn't work all the time, but it's a fairly decent guideline, and that's apply what I call the random person test. And that's, if you were to go up to a random person and say this sentence, would it express a complete thought? Let's look at an example. I eat a lot of chocolate if I am nervous or bored. Now together, these, when read together, these seem fine. But if we look at them in isolation, I eat a lot of chocolate, that looks okay. If I am nervous or bored, if I were to say that in isolation and apply the random person test, if I were to go up to a random person and say, if I am nervous or bored, would they make sense of anything I've said? Would they be, would I have said something complete? And the answer is no, I wouldn't have. So I can see that that's a fragment, and it needs to be fixed simply by combining these two. I eat a lot of chocolate if I am nervous or bored. So there are some common problem areas for fragments, some common areas where fragments often occur. And those happen in introductory phrases, add-on phrases, and subordinating conjunctions. So let's look at each one of those in turn. Introductory phrases. Here's a fragment. Walking past the house, the mailman noticed the dog was off its leash. So this first part, walking past the house, is an introductory phrase. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence or a complete thought. We simply fix it by adding it to the sentence that it is broken off from. So it's one complete thought. In this case, we need to put a little comma in there. So here's an add-on phrase that comes at the end of a sentence. I love reading good books, especially when I am not assigned to read them. So this last phrase, especially when I am not assigned to read them, is a fragment. It cannot stand alone, so we need to add it to that first independent clause, that first main part of the sentence. So it looks like, I love reading good books, especially when I'm not assigned to read them, all as one sentence. I felt like an outcast, living on the edge of society. Living on the edge of society is an add-on phrase there, and we just need to combine it with that previous sentence to make it one complete sentence. So subordinating conjunctions, I've already shown a couple examples of those. That was as Jake was eating ice cream. That was a subordinating conjunction. And so let's look at another example. Whenever I go back home, I hang out with my high school friends. If we take that first part, whenever I go back home, in isolation, that alone cannot stand as a sentence. And so we need to just combine that with the sentence that comes after that completes that thought that is begun with that subordinating conjunction or that dependent clause. Or you could rearrange the sentence completely and say, I hang out with my friends from high school whenever I go back home. And that would also be an acceptable fix. Here's another example of a dependent clause or a subordinating conjunction. Because I have never had good vision, I will never make a good pilot. Because I have never had good vision cannot stand alone. That is not a complete thought, and it needs to be combined in order to be a complete sentence. And here we can see the corrected version. Now, not all fragments are bad. Sometimes writers will choose to write a fragment intentionally because it fits their needs stylistically. It helps the text read a certain way and have a certain tone and rhythm. And so writers will intentionally do fragments. So not all fragments are bad. This is not a rule that's 100% all the time. So let's look at some examples here. Never try drugs, not even once. So you can see here, not even once is a fragment. But it's a stylistic fragment in this case because the writer might have been really trying to emphasize that not even once part. And so they're letting it stand alone as if it were its own sentence, when technically it's a fragment, but it's okay. This could be considered a stylistic fragment, an acceptable fragment. So the rule is to never write fragments unless it works stylistically. So you can see what I did there. Unless it works stylistically is a fragment, but it kind of works in this case. The point is if you know it's a fragment and you're doing it for stylistic reasons, that is one thing. But if you don't know it's a fragment and it's just a mistake, then that's something you'll need to really watch for when you're proofreading. So you can see that the fragments rule, it's more of a strong guideline than a hard and fast rule, as the pirate says. Okay, so remember that you can order the book, Just the Basics of English Grammar, on Amazon.com if you prefer doing these exercises on hard copy paper, or of course the chapters are included free as part of this course.